Welcome, everybody, to this month's installment of the Inside CE webinar series. This month, we're talking about inside system integration. Before we start, a little bit of housekeeping. We are going to be recording the session. And if you have any questions, you can stick them in the Q&A chat, and we'll get to them as best we can. And if we don't get to all of them, we're going to try and respond to them and get you some answers afterwards. And today, I'm joined by two distinguished gentlemen, Selase Hotsonyame, Director of Alliance Partnerships, Mark Murrell, President, Carrier's Edge, and we are talking about system integration. Now, if I pulled 10 people off of the street and said, hey, do you want to talk about system integration? The looks I'm going to get are maybe mixed. But actually, there's a whole bunch of value in here if you understand what's going on. Now, something you may not know about me, I'm not exactly a tech guy. So I'm hoping one or both of you can take a second and explain the idea behind system integration to me as if I'm a golden retriever. What is this all about?
Do we have to answer in a series of woofs?
As long as there's a cookie at the end, it's fine.
Yeah. Well, system integration is something that's become sort of a catch-all phrase for a lot of different things, but really it is just the process by which two different systems talk to each other. So there's really two parts to it. One is that any outside systems or maybe different systems within the organization need to understand each other's language in order to speak to each other. And then the second part of that is how that language is used to have some kind of meaningful conversation. And the first part of it isn't really that difficult. So using the analogy of understanding the language, it's not that difficult to build translation guides so that different systems can talk to each other, and that we know that when the other system says login ID, for instance, they mean username in our system, and somebody else's system calls it a student name, but it's all the same thing. That's not that difficult. The trickier part is, what do you do once you have that figured out? What is that meaningful conversation that allows these systems to share data in a way that is really going to be beneficial for people? That's where the challenges come up, and that's usually the part of it that people don't think that much about. So they start by talking about integration primarily in means of or in the context of different systems talking to each other, and then they sort of leave it at that. They just assume the other part takes care of itself, but the other part is really where all of the value is.
And when you say system, you just mean like my HR system and what my dashpan system, like
any
software system, right?
Yeah, any software system or hardware system. I mean, a lot of times we have software that is talking to hardware as well. So, or hardware systems that talk to each other through software interfaces. So any two systems talking to each other are going to be integrated.
Okay. So if I'm a fleet, why do I care? People are talking about this a lot. I get folks phoning me all, my system's great. It's integrated with this and this. Why do I care? Should I care?
Right. Well, so that is touching on something. And Selase, I'll let you give the real answer on why people should care. But you touch on the reason why I thought this would be a good subject in the first place. Because until about 6 years ago, nobody in trucking did care, and nobody was talking about it. So we've been selling our service into the trucking industry for a long time now, in excess of 15 years. And for the first, like nearly 10 years or so, nobody ever talked about integration. It was not a word that anybody even used. It just wasn't an issue. And during that time, there really wasn't that much in terms of back office system options in the trucking industry. Everybody had a TMS, and more they had an automated maintenance management system, but that would be sort of the extent of it. Or they would have a satellite that's tied to the TMS. But it's only been in the last 6 or so years where all of a sudden Silicon Valley discovered that the trucking industry exists and funded hundreds of vendors to come in and start providing these back office solutions, that people started realizing that having them talk to each other may be useful. And outside of trucking, system integration is a standard part of building a system. When you build a software product, you build it so that it can talk to other systems in particular ways. And there are standardized ways of doing that that you generally build into the product. And so those kind of outside vendors came into trucking with a solution and just assumed that integration was going to be part of it, and started talking it up and talking, oh, we integrate with that, we integrate with this, we support this integration or this particular authentication method or this particular protocol or whatever. And all of a sudden, everybody in trucking started picking up that language and talking about it and asking, well, is this integrated? Do you integrate with them? What does it mean? And so they started talking about it a lot. And there is real value in it, but it is fairly new in trucking. So back office systems in general are pretty new in trucking. We've done webinars in the past where we talked about the fact that HR systems and driver scorecards and automated coaching and all of that stuff is pretty new into the industry compared to other industries. So it's only natural that the industry is going to start going through the normal process of growing pains to figure out what to do with that and what to watch for, how to use it, where does it make sense. So yeah, so Selase, then I'll let you share why it actually may be useful for people.
Well, I think coming into this industry, I took for granted how, standard system integrations work. But when I started with Carrier's Edge and started going to different trade shows or trucking shows, every show you're having 4, 5, 6 people come to you to talk about building integration. And at first it was great. Let's move forward. Let's see what we can do. But then you start realizing how, I want to say, maybe young in the process some of these companies were. So there's no standardization. There were a lot of hoops to jump through to find how our system and their systems could talk to each other. I think we came even across a company. You see more companies like this in trucking their goal is just to build that intermediary where different systems could talk to each other. And you had that market kind of build up because it was just new. It was something the industry hadn't perfected yet or didn't have that experience in. I think I've only been here coming to 2 years, but I've seen a lot of the industry kind of mature in a way. So we're going to shows now you're not having that same number of companies coming to you asking for integrations, and those standards are starting to be there. But I think for the fleets and the decision makers when it comes to deciding which software or systems you're looking into to fill whatever business need, they now need to kind of have that second look to say, what am I purchasing? If a company is telling me, they have 5, 6, 10 different integrations, are they actually solving a business need of mine? And maybe how well is this integration put in place? Because we'll have companies integrate with us, but if they're only pulling, user results, is that a sufficient integration for the fleet? Is that all they want to see from, having our service integrated with another? So then I think it's still, I want to say not early, but in a stage where the industry now needs to understand what value are they going to find in those integrations? How are they going to look at those companies that are now building integrations for them, and how to best move forward from there?
That raises a really good point, that going back to your original question, Rick, that not all integrations are really worth paying attention to. So it's not always going to solve problems. It's not always going to save time. There are some times where you can have different systems talking to each other and passing data back and forth that actually only save time in specific circumstances. And sometimes they replace functions that really aren't that difficult or time consuming to do manually. So in those cases, it's often not worth the headache to set them up. In a lot of times, because this is fairly new into the industry, and every company has its own very well-defined ways of doing things that grew out of manual processes, it's not always easy to replace those with automated systems. And sometimes, sometimes the best option is to change the process to match the system, because sometimes the system will reflect best practices and how to do certain things. A good example might be background checks and things like that, where somebody who's built an HR system that will handle that kind of thing is going to build in all the best practices around that anyway. So you're better off to just follow what they're doing. But in other cases, you've got very well-defined processes within the fleet that grew out of the business needs, and the software is not going to replace those. So, or it's not easily going to replace those, and it's not really worth the effort to try and make it. So not all situations are really good good candidates for integration to take over or to kind of automate some of the processes. So Selase, you mentioned using course data, and that's one of the most common places where we see people requesting integrations, is being able to pull course results from drivers out of our system, put them into some other system for a different purpose. And most of the time, that is a pretty good use case where you want to be able to do that. But that also opens up a whole lot of other concerns about, what is it? We'll get to later, sort of the security concerns and things like that. But other uses, like creating users and doing automatic assignments and things like that, sometimes those are better handled manually, at least in the beginning, until you understand the full parameters around how the company is going to do that and what the weirdo situations are that you have to handle. And then build your automation or build your integration points to sort of capitalize on that. Because if you go into it without understanding all of those intricacies, you can end up with an integration that just creates more problem than it solves.
So before we go on, I did see someone had raised their hand. There is a question. If you do have a question, you can just stick it right in the Q&A chat, and we'll get to it. I wonder, at some point, I wanted to ask from a user side, from a fleet side, what it is that I should look for. But if it's the case that in some integrations it's just not worthwhile to have those systems integrate, in other cases it's very much worthwhile. I don't know if we can really articulate that question meaningfully unless we have examples of which systems we're talking about. So let's say, well, what do I need to look for if a company comes to me and says, all right, my system integrates with this HR system you already have. How can I tell if there's value in there?
If I was to take a stab at that, I think all these, a fleet's going to have a testing period. They're going to be going through the software to make sure it fits into their company and that, it's something they're happy to use before they move forward and purchase. But that same effort in testing that solution, you should be testing that other system you're wanting to integrate with, making sure that, again, using us as an example, if you're pulling our data from Carrier's Edge into another system, maybe you're not taking the time to learn about our reporting functionality and the other features we have around it. So by moving integration first without learning the ins and outs of the other software that's been developed, you might not be realizing the full value of that software by itself. So it's not just let's look at the integration, but let's look out on those other features in that other system that we're not going to be using because now we're pulling a set, piece of data into our system. So is that
like buying a truck and all of a sudden this other company comes and says, I have this amazing aftermarket fuel efficiency management system. But I don't realize that the truck already had that built in at the factory, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
To use the sort of comparison. Okay.
And I think I've seen that a lot in the industry where you'll have companies that have they sell a lot of features into their software, and the buyer doesn't take the time to understand what all those features are, so they'll buy other products when they're already paying for a certain maybe you have a communication tool that comes with your service. Well, you're not aware of it and you go buy another communication tool how do you integrate that? It's not necessary, but at times maybe you do prefer to use one of those over the other. But if it's just a case you had no idea that was built in, then you're double purchasing.
Yeah, that's a really good point. One of the other things that I would say when you're looking at that, when somebody comes along and says, "Oh, we're integrated with this or that or whatever," I guess the question is, well, how are you integrated and what does that actually look like? And that's where we'll probably get into the questions about how do you evaluate those things and what to be watching for. But everybody says they're integrated. Like Selase is saying, every show that we go to, there's somebody, some vendor was like, "Oh, integrate, let's integrate." And we're starting to see fleets now that are kind of picking up that language and they want to know what sort of integrations we have. Well, we have some that make sense, and we have others where we haven't really been able to justify it because we don't see that it's really going to save any time, or we have concerns about how people are using some of that information or what they're doing with it, which I'm sure we'll get to later as well. But it's always important to look at the specifics of how these things are being done and what does it actually get you. So when they say, yes, we're integrated with this or integrated with that, what does that actually look like? And what is that saving? You know, what parts of that workflow are being moved into an automated process through integration? Which I guess now I'm realizing I should have gone way back to the beginning of your question about integration. What is it? And that whole business of people getting of different systems to talk to each other, the number one reason you do that is because you want to have things happen automatically across different systems so you don't have to manually do it yourself. And the most simple use case is creating users. If I create a user in one system, I hire a new driver, create a user in one system, I have to go and create a user in another system, create them in all the different systems. That can be a bit tedious. Totally understand that. But automating it isn't always the best option. A lot of times it is, but there are sometimes tricks around that. So we talk about automation a lot because the central point of integration is to be able to save steps. So do things, the things that you were doing manually, have them be done automatically now. So okay, what are those parts of the process that are going to really benefit from having them done automatically versus having them done, you know, just manually, where you can also customize what you're actually doing?
Okay, so although I do want to lean much of the conversation towards that sort of that user end, right? That fleet that has several systems. Before we go there, on the system side, say the stuff that we do, why would a given tech company or maybe starting out, do they have it in mind that they want to build their product so that it integrates, or is this kind of an afterthought?
No, everybody builds it thinking about that because you're always thinking about the user experience and you want to provide the best possible user experience. And if you can show that you've got more of a complete solution, that we save you time by pulling data from the system and we save you time by passing data over to this other place, that's generally going to be a better user experience. So generally people are thinking about it from the beginning.
Okay. And on that user side, this isn't just about making things more efficient. This isn't just about, you know, not having to log in 3 times, right? It's that if it's done right, if it's done well, if the two systems are compatible in a certain way, there's additional value in a system integration that any one system on its own could not give you. Do I have that correct?
Oh, 100%.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. If it's done properly, it unlocks opportunities and certainly unlocks value that you would not have otherwise. So, you know, Selase is a great example of places where there are systems that sort of overlap in terms of feature sets, but the best integrations are the ones where the foreign system is implementing some feature set or some functionality that the core system would never be able to justify adding in or really wouldn't be able to do on its own. So a good example of that would be something like Idelic has done a nice job of pulling data from different systems, putting it all together and adding some intelligence to it to give you some meaningful action items that come out of it. That's a really good use case for integration. And all of those different systems that they pull data from, those people are never going to build that kind of intelligence because you have to aggregate the data first in order to do that. So I would say that that kind of thing is a place where you can unlock extra value. Or be able to do, look at what we're doing with some of the dashcam providers where we're doing the automated training assignment. Well, the dashcam provider is never going to do that on their own. So that's where some integration will unlock some extra value that was never going to happen otherwise.
Okay. So,
Rick, just
yeah.
On the flip side, though, I think sometimes you'll have companies that will use that integration as more of a marketing tool. They'll tell you they can integrate, but they're not adding much value with that integration. I think fleets need to be aware of that. So sometimes we'll see requests for an integration come through. It's not because we've worked with that company in the past. It's because they're trying to close a deal. And when you're trying to close a deal for one customer, how much effort is going to that integration, how much of a solution is being built with that integration. So there's now the flip side where I think you need to be aware of if somebody's trying to sell you an integration, where I think it's just a marketing tool.
So Selase bringing the cynicism into the webinar. So all vendors need to know that if you're going to get an integration with us, you've got to get through Selase's BS detector and really provide a strong value proposition for how it's actually going to help people.
Yeah. And on that tech side, is it difficult? Is it a lot of work?
It shouldn't be.
I was gonna say, I think depending on the systems, more companies they know how, or their platform or development teams know how to build things in a way they're using, say, a REST API that any other platform or development team will know how to connect to. So again, if you're coming to a point where an integration is difficult, I would assume that some of the basic tenets of that web development or platform development aren't being followed. So
right.
Yeah.
Now I will say I'd be willing to bet there's at least one person in the audience that doesn't know what an API is. Not what it stands for, but what it actually is. What's an API?
Oh, so what does API stand for? Do we put that in there?
Yes, I wondered about that. You mentioned a REST API. So API is a phrase that is bandied about pretty commonly, and it is an application programming interface, which is just a way for systems to talk to each other. It is a way for one part of a system, and sometimes they're within the system directly, but it's just a way for one system to talk to another that says, if you ask me these questions, I will give you these answers. And that's generally what the documentation says, so that when you're building something, okay, I can ask these questions in this particular format, and I will get this kind of answer back. And so that's how they talk to each other.
So the API is like a software glad hand.
Yes.
Okay. Cool.
I don't know the reference you just used, Rick.
You need to take
it's not a truck, dude. Course. It's not a truck.
Yes, it is a little bit like that. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Or it's like your sort of translation dictionary that here are the words and here's the the user manual. Ask it like this, and you will get these answers.
Okay. So if someone's going to market that to me and they're going to come say, we've got this API, it sounds like technical jargon, but it just means
to translate. Of course you do. How else are you going to connect? Right. If you don't have it, then you're really in trouble.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's like coming in and saying, man, our truck has got tires on it. You buy a truck from us, you're getting doors, you're getting fenders, you get everything. Well, yeah, I hope so.
And I'll throw them in for free.
Yeah.
All right. Okay.
Yeah.
So we talked about marketing tool. We talked about some unexpected value. Should I be worried about my data?
Yes.
I mean, every once in a while, the stories come up, right? This data was stolen.
Oh my God, yes.
Okay.
So, yeah,
and the data of my people, right? The data of my drivers.
Yeah, I started taking a couple of notes just before we got into this and realized we probably could do a whole separate webinar on privacy, and we probably should, because that is becoming more and more of an issue across the industry. 100%. And when I said earlier, but ask companies what it looks like, what the integration looks like, that is one of the number one things to look at is what are they doing with that information? First of all, what are they getting access to? If somebody is integrating with a particular system, what data are they going to have access to? And is that really something that you want them to have access to? So if they're going to pull out all of these records, are you sure you want that vendor to have access to that data? And the answer in a lot of cases should be no. You don't need them to have that. A lot of times, people don't really pay that much attention to what's being pulled out or where that is being stored. And they may find that even though they've got a data retention policy where they are going to delete all of this information on an annual basis, just because they want to protect themselves, they don't want any plaintiff subpoena to pull out stuff that they're not interested in sharing. Well, they find that some vendor has actually been pulling and storing that information, and that can be a problem later. So that is something to be very careful about. We have seen cases where integrations are very inefficiently built and pull all kinds of data that they don't really need, pull all kinds of extraneous data, and do it way too often. And that ends up causing other problems. They pull all kinds of stuff, and they maybe don't store it as safely as they should, so it can be a problem. And people will look at this and say, well, that I'm being crazy, because come on, it's just training data. Who cares? Who cares if somebody failed a course 6 months ago? Well, a lot of the updated privacy policies that are coming out of California, coming out of Quebec, coming out of other places, treat that as private personal data now. Training data is becoming private personal information. Anything that might negatively influence somebody's career prospects or might reflect badly on them at some point in the future is considered personal and private information now and needs to be protected. So there are situations where you need to be thinking about that. So yeah, maybe you don't care that some driver failed an inspection course, but what happens if that driver has an equipment malfunction that leads to a crash, and then there's a lawsuit? All of this stuff becomes an issue, and you want to make sure that you have protected that data, that you know where it is, that any of your data retention policies are being respected across all of the different vendors, all of those kind of things. You need to be protecting that. So that's just protecting the data. The other part of it is, what are they actually doing with it? And so are they selling that data? Are they using it to do some machine learning on something that you really don't want your data being used as a training set for? So there's a whole lot of things to be thinking about there.
So if I've got, let's say I'm already in with an HR system that I like very much, working with them for a long time, and they now are going to integrate with this additional party doing some other thing, right? Going to bring extra value to me. The responsibility is on whose shoulders to assure that there is data security with the HR company that I'm already using? Is it me as a fleet owner who is sort of by proxy bringing that in? Is it just some stuff somewhere in the terms and conditions?
Yeah, it is definitely on the fleet. I mean, everybody has to take responsibility for ensuring the security of their own data. Absolutely. Any respectable vendor is going to do that as well. So the HR system provider probably did some evaluation of that when thinking about the integration and thinking about what data they were going to share with that other party. I mean, that's the kind of thing that we look through, and the kind of things that we make decisions about, which which data points we're going to expose and which ones we aren't. So that is something that the vendor probably is looking at, but fleets definitely should be thinking about that. They should be thinking about what's happening with that and asking questions of that other party. I mean, if you are thinking about making use of the integration, you're probably using both of those systems already. So what are they doing? Who has access to what? What are they doing with that information? All of that kind of stuff.
Okay. All right. Selase, I want to go back. Yes, go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say now there are different security certifications around that, and for a fleet, I think if you're working with a company and they are talking integrations, for me, when that discussion comes up, one of my not that it's a favorite question, but it shows that there's some consideration. That first question is, where's our data being stored? It, there's basic questions a fleet can ask just to have an understanding of what a company is doing with their information. So, ask that simple question, are you happy with that? Are you happy where they're transmitting data? Where, it's a basic one, but it's a
Mhm.
first one. And from there, maybe if your team's not as enhanced with different security policies, but companies, you can look into that, what kind of certifications they have, they'll share with you, then you can go Google it and see what it may mean. So are they SOC 2 certified or whatnot? What is their retention policy with the data they're storing? It's they're just initial questions you can ask, and hopefully don't go down a rabbit hole, but it can give you initial understanding of what's happening with your driver's information.
Can
And
you?
what are their
Yeah.
policies on what they will do with that? More and more people are looking to sell that data. I touched on that a minute ago, and it's becoming a huge issue. Like hundreds of these tech vendors got lots of funding over the past decade, and a good chunk of those pitch decks were talking about how they are going to compile and aggregate data and essentially become data brokers. They have nicer names for it, but they're taking that information and they're going to use it in ways that are not necessarily great. And anybody here has seen it as well. They've seen that when they post jobs in certain places that those jobs are going to be advertised to their current employees, or other fleets jobs are going to be advertised to their current drivers and things like that. That kind of data security is something that is becoming more of a hot button issue. So you have to pay attention to that.
So then there are two danger issues there. One, there is what's going to happen with the data once it's,
Mhm.
say, secured with someone else. But the other is does this integration create a series of potential gaps in cybersecurity? Right.
Oh yeah,
Right. So
100%.
so so yeah, two different things there. Um, in terms of asking the question, where is my data stored? What's an example of a good answer, and what's an example of a not good answer?
I mean, if it's
I don't want to call anyone out, but
it's there's a lot of established companies where, maybe you're an Amazon fan and they say, we are using AWS servers in the Eastern United States. You hear that, you're probably, okay, that's great. Maybe a central location in Canada or something like that. You might react different if they say, oh, our data is being stored in, West Africa and Ghana. So it's you might be like, wait, why is it being stored there? So it's like I said, it's a simple question, and
Mhm.
you'll be able to discern from there what you feel about that country's data policies with,
Ah,
what's being stored.
Yeah. Yeah, our servers are in Belarus, and that's where our developers are contracted to. Well, that's going to be a little bit of a concern.
right.
Yeah.
Now, you were not saying our servers are in Belarus. You were saying,
No, our
imagine a
servers
company
are
says
not.
that.
But if somebody says that, yeah, that kind of thing. Obviously, and it's in the news now because there's an issue with TikTok and potentially being directed to sell to a U.S. company, because it's obviously, like, TikTok is well known to be a giant data collection engine for the Chinese government. So potentially there's going to be a forced hand there that they're going to have to sell it to some US organization. But that's sort of the extreme example where all the data is being stored in places where you may not want it to be stored.
Got it. Got it. Okay. All right. So, hmm, when we're looking at, oh, actually, before I ask that question, I want to ask Selase a question. I want to go back to his BS detector a little bit. If a company comes to you, um, you know, uh, e-learning provider, asking to integrate, what sorts of things are you looking for? Do you have like a checklist in terms of this is going to be a worthwhile partnership, or this is not going to be a worthwhile partnership?
It's I don't want to overcomplicate the process, but for me, it's what value are they bringing to that customer? So if we have a lot of mutual customers already, um, that kind of answers the question where I can say, okay, we have a good number of customers using their product, they find value in it. But if somebody's going to come up to me and there's one customer that's using their service and that's driving their integration, they haven't proven themselves in the market. Then I'm there, we have a good user base. If you're completely new to our user base, then it's almost like I need a pitch. I need a value pitch. Why are we going to put your service on our partner network and, speak well about your product? I don't want to do that with just one customer. So it's that would be the first step if it's they're a new entrant to the market, they have a limited customer base and they want to, maybe it's more benefit for them to close a deal and that's why they're pushing it. But sometimes you will have a new company come in and what they're trying to do is an innovative. It is, you know it's maybe they're, what's a good one to use? They're doing something different in the market that we're not sure if it's going to take off or if it's going to fail. We've probably
Mhm.
heard terms like, oh, we're bringing machine learning or AI into the industry. And you think, well, let's see where this goes. So sometimes you'll be, or I'll be willing to, give that a try to see where they're taking things. But for the most part, um, when it comes to is it a BS detector? I don't like
Mhm.
the term, but it's more, is there value that they're going to bring to our partners? Is there something that if the fleet sees them on our partner page and they ask about them, our team's going to be able to talk about their product with confidence and not be afraid to refer them. So,
Yeah.
You
Now,
also pay attention to whether or not they have a track record both in tech and in trucking. Like to be really successful as a vendor in this industry, yeah, you definitely have to know the tech industry. You have to understand how to build a product, but you definitely have to know the trucking industry too. It doesn't mean everybody in the company has to be an expert and has to have 20 years of driving experience, but there has to be people inside the organization that really understand trucking. And I've seen you evaluate people, you talk to them at shows, and some of the things that you're asking really are questions about their background in the industry and how well they know what's going on. So I think that's an important thing to look at as well. Because if somebody comes in and builds an integration and is pitching an integration and they don't really understand how tracking works, you know it's not going to solve any problems. It's going to create more problems than it solves because it's going to be something that is super useful in a very specific situation that almost never exists in trucking, right? It's going to be a great system that only works from 12 till 5, Tuesday through Thursday. Well, that's not how trucking operates. So, I haven't come across anything that does that, but that kind of thing. Like it has to be built by somebody who understands the ins and outs of the industry.
and I was thinking of someone like Selase in particular as an extra layer of security. So when we were talking earlier about it's the fleet's responsibility to figure out where the data is going. I, I run a trucking company.
Mm.
I don't know a lot of it about these things. But if I'm working with someone already, say in my learning management system, right, who knows this stuff, and we can have this conversation, you can explain it to me. You know, there's that expert on your side. It's like having an insurance guy on your side,
Mhm.
right? Yeah.
yep.
Okay.
I think it's you're gonna, a lot of these fleets they'll have companies they've worked with for a while, trusted companies. I think the companies that stick around in the industry will start to earn that reputation and whatnot. I not to kind of go too off topic, but I think we've seen it in the news when companies get hacked and their data gets leaked. It is a big deal. So you're gonna start, as you hear more on those cyber attacks and whatnot, you want to make sure the companies you're working with are doing something. They are taking a step to protect your company's data because you're opening up yourself and you want to make sure that even if it's a small team, the basics steps are being followed, that you don't have to worry that somebody's going to send an email saying, hey, this is your boss. Click on this link to buy me stuff. And, your experienced staff is going to click on that link. Where are they going to do next? So it is becoming very important.
Mhm.
Okay. So, Mark, I made myself a note a couple days ago. It was just like one line with some stars around it, and it says decision maker versus people actually using the solution.
Okay. Yeah, so that's part of figuring out how it's going to work in a way that actually adds value. And the important thing is that when you're evaluating these different products and considering the integration, that it isn't just the higher up people that are involved. It has to involve the people that are actually going to be using it on a regular basis. And that's where I was talking about earlier, that sometimes these things look good, and they get sold as being great time savers, but they're replacing something that doesn't really take much time anyway, or it's not that complicated. So you're not really buying yourself a lot of value by going through the headache of adding an integration to automate some workflow. Sometimes these things are just better to be done manually. So even something as seemingly straightforward as creating users in different systems, well, it is useful to have that sped up a little bit and to remove steps when you can. But at the same time, a lot of these different systems have slightly different nuances, and you may create a user in one way in one system, then create them in a different system, but you add some different attributes for that person. Or maybe you've created them there and you assign them into one place that matches your organizational structure in that system, but in another system, you need to do it differently because you've got a different structure in there. And that kind of stuff can be very time consuming to really automate. And sometimes it's not worth it. Sometimes it's easier to just do it manually. So even things like Selase had the example earlier of pulling training records to move them into different systems. That's generally a fairly safe kind of integration. You want systems to be able to have all of the same data in the same places. Makes perfect sense. But in terms of automating training assignment, which is one thing that we've seen some interest in, people wanting to automate that when this happens in this system, well, we want all of these things to be assigned in this other system. That can be tricky and potentially full of a lot of problems, because there may be a lot of nuances in your training assignment process that aren't reflected in some of those automation options. So when we built our dashcam integration, we put a lot of time into making sure that we address those situations, making sure that they're handled so that people have the option to reflect how they actually use the training system and not just kind of do blanket assignments in something. So that's the kind of stuff that comes out. You discover that when you have those ground level people that are the regular users of the system that are part of that discussion around how the integration is going to work, what is it going to replace, what are we going to do instead, how do we handle this situation. You need the people that are doing that stuff on a day-to-day basis in order to make that happen. So I think we've offended Selase and he left.
It's a tough room, man.
Yeah.
Okay, so we covered. I mean, that's sort of one version of the hype versus value thing, right?
Yeah.
Like, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, there are definitely places where integration is fantastic. I don't want to come off as cynical as Selase is about it, but I think there are a lot of ways to do it, and it makes perfect sense. So, things like user creation, definitely there are lots of ways to look at automating that. Nobody wants to create the same user across 4 different systems. That's tedious and boring. And there are ways to make that work really nicely. Pulling reports for use in scorecards or for building other types of reporting, KPI management, that kind of thing makes a lot of sense. As long as you spend the time to look at the data that's being pulled, like we were talking about, how is it being stored, what's being done with it, are they only pulling the stuff that they actually need, all of that kind of thing, that can really save some time. I wouldn't get into too much of we want to automate assignments or some of these other things, even in cases, and this is a bit of a hit and miss. We've had some cases where people want to have it have drivers get the ability to take courses through other systems. And sometimes that can work really well. It's not that difficult to implement through the desktop. We've definitely got a lot of partners that have built integrations where a driver can run courses through a different system. But when you move into the mobile world, it's a whole different beast. And now more and more people are doing that through mobile apps, and it is trickier. So a lot of times that's not really worth the hassle, especially mobile apps these days are so easy. You tap something and it pops a different app and just takes you into the thing you want to go into. Like, is it really necessary? And this is the thing that I get with the questions about single sign-on that comes up a fair bit. So that's usually one of the common integration points that people ask about is single sign-on. I only want to sign on one place and never have to do it again. Well, more and more your browser stores your password anyway. You can stay logged in different services depending on your access level. Like, how difficult is it to log into these different things? And this is where sort of trucking being new to the game is a challenge, that there's a lot of standardization for single sign-on that most vendors in trucking don't support yet. So as much as there are like ways to build single sign-on into applications, if nobody supports those standard languages, then you really can't do it. So that's part of why we haven't done it, because nobody supports the standard protocols yet. So anyway, that's some things to think about. So Selase, you've rejoined us.
Yeah, sorry about that.
All good, all good. I wanted to ask one more question about the tech side. How difficult is it to integrate two systems, and who pays for it?
I mean, as long
As a
as
user, is it me?
Yeah, not me is always who pays for it. Yes, not me. That's a good question. And yeah, well, the answer is usually it can be all of the above. Sometimes the vendors will pay for it. Sometimes the customers will pay for it. I would say, I don't think we've had any where we've billed a customer for those, because generally if somebody gets through all of Selase's hurdles to the point where we say it's worth doing, there's enough people that are going to benefit from it that we're just going to do it. And so I don't know, there may be some other vendors that are charging customers for building the integration, but most of the time, if they are charging, they're going to be charging a discounted rate because they recognize that it's going to be for a very specific for audience. There's going to get some good value out of it. They're going to be able to, amortize that cost across a lot of different customers. So they generally are not, from what I've seen, charging much for building those, unless it's something that you really can't justify otherwise. If somebody wanted a very specific integration and we couldn't really justify it based on our customer base, then yeah, we might look at billing them for it.
We spoke on this very topic. We spoke a little bit earlier about one of the dangers. One of the dangers is of course data management. The other is cybersecurity. And do these integrations actually represent a third party, like a nefarious third party risk, where it's easier to break an arm at the joint than it is right in the middle of the bone? Should I be concerned there, where these systems integrate, that it's a danger in terms of cybercriminal?
I think the reference there about at the joint, it's what data is actually being passed through. So sometimes I think when you're looking at an integration, at least for us, if somebody asks us to pass over information other than the driver results and whatnot, it's the question becomes, why do you need that information? So it's for the fleets, I would make sure I'm understanding what's being passed through. What is are there markers that can identify personal information about the driver, and then what's that risk if that's being passed through? Because you're right, if you're having information being passed through there, it's not that they just have to get into one system to get that. Now there's two systems that there's two companies where they can send fish
Mhm.
Right.
Yeah,
Indeed.
I think that's bang on. I'll pick up where he was heading there. If your data is going to external locations and you do have concerns, like if it's not being protected, if it's extraneous data that's being sent there, that is another risk point where if somebody gets into that other company, they can get at this data. And that may be a problem. Yeah, we do have people that have asked for a lot of records to be sent or a lot of data points to be sent with our stuff, and we've said no. We're not going to share that because that just introduces a risk, and we don't really see where there would be value in that. But it is definitely something to pay attention to.
Okay. I want to I want to try and distill this down to some best practices, things to look for. So in terms of first, figuring out whether I actually need integration. What should I be thinking about? Like a couple of quick things.
Well, integration is always a step towards automation. So once these things are integrated, what processes are going to be optimized in theory or automated? And what is that existing process really costing you? Number one. So what is the headache that it's going to remove? Or what is the new value that it's going to unlock? What is the new thing that you'll be able to do without that? And how much value is there in that new thing? So that's the first thing to look at is what is it going to do, once it's up and running.
Okay. All right. And then in terms of security, what should I be thinking about? Obviously, where are you storing my data?
And what data? What are you storing? And do you really need all of that? And what are you doing with it?
Right. And of course
And sorry. And then
yeah,
who else is going to have access to that? Which captures what are the security policies in this other company in terms of protecting that information? Who else do they share it with? Do they have some outside vendors that they will then be sharing it with? So you have this cascade sharing of your information. And then the part that we were talking about before, is there any situation where they might bundle that and sell it? Whether they claim it's anonymized or aggregated or whatever, but is there any situation where they would do it, where they would give it to anybody else? And how long do they keep it for? They keep it forever, or do they have some sort of policy where they're going to get rid of it?
right, right. Is there a third thing that I should think about in terms of best practices, or like if I can lock those two down, I'm doing okay.
But I don't think most of the companies are going to go in there and audit the security policies. They're not going to go inspect the database themselves. But if you were to ask if there's any certification the company does have that they could share with you, I mean, that's something you can maybe have more confidence in, because if they tell you, yes, our data is encrypted, I mean, you'll go in, you're not going to go into their database and look at what that encryption looks like, what that encryption key is. So it's I think sometimes, like, I know when we're audited, they make sure we're following our policies, but you're the fleet's not the one that's going to go in and do the audit. So
Mhm.
maybe just ask what company is doing it. May you have more trust in that company as well, and there is a process that's being followed.
Mhm.
So there are ways of sort of certifying non-tech things that I might require uh, for my fleet. So my insurance partner might say, this, and this resource, they are certified by this and such body. They're trustworthy. Does anything like that exist for these tech solutions? They're like, if I look at this certification or whatever it is, I've got a little more trust there, or is it a little more like the Wild West?
That's a good question. And you're talking about you're talking about certifying that integrations follow certain standards and have certain trustworthiness to them. And I'm not aware of any real standards like that exist. So Selase is talking about some that apply to data centers and data management, and there are several of those. And depending on the sectors that people serve, they may be subject to a variety of different oversight, usually coming from government and some sort of larger organizations that have their own standards. But that just talks about what happens with the data and sort of the code management practices and things like that. But as far as the integration side of it, I don't think there is anything. That's a really good observation, where that would be very valuable to be able to say that this integration, follows these best practices or whatever. And as a result, you can trust it for these particular things. Yeah, that's a good idea.
Save that for some enterprising tech person. Put that together.
Next tech conference I go to, see if we
Absolutely
can find somebody to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're coming up close to the end here. Is there anything else that you want to share, is on your mind, or think that people need to know about it?
I think the first thing for me is, remember what we said right off the bat, that integration isn't always helpful. It's not utopia. It's not a box that is checked, and if they say that they've got an integration, then all your problems are all solved. It's never that simple. A lot of times it's not going to make anything any better, or it's going to create other problems. Some realizing one of the things we didn't even talk about is that when you have two different systems talking to each other, you do end up having to do data management. You do end up having to do cleanup. Right? If we are saying that all of these systems are integrated, well, you're going to have some configuration that you have to do so that you can map users in one to users in another, and that needs to be maintained and that needs to be managed. So you may be saving time by automating some tasks, but you're adding another task, which is that you've got to be staying up to date on that information. We see that now on the dash cam stuff, where people have got a great integration up and running, but they don't manage the data there. And so they get disconnected, where one dash cam events from one person get ending up applied to somebody else because they didn't keep the data clean. So they ended up sort of breaking those connections. But
can I put the screws to you a little bit in these last 3 minutes, because we've got a question that just came through. It says, Dave from Safety and Compliance PEI, I have Carrier's Edge that I use in all my trucking companies that I look after. How does integration affect what I do with Carrier's Edge for my clients? In 2 minutes.
Well, thanks, Dave, for making it difficult for me. It does, in a situation like what you're doing, Dave, where you're doing consulting type stuff and you're assisting them, the biggest place where integration is going to help is setting up something where some of that data can be pulled out automatically and put into a centralized system that you are using. So other safety consultants have sometimes built a system where they will pull records from their customer accounts and bring those into like a scorecard to help you identify which people need help in different areas, which of your fleets need more attention, that kind of thing. That's going to be the number one place where it can help. So I would look at that, and support can certainly help you figure those things out. That's going to be the big place. If your customers are using dash cams or using some of the other systems that we already integrate with, then that can be helpful as well, because that can, in specific cases, optimize some of their workflow. So when those customers come and tell you that they don't have time for X because they're so busy with whatever, well, you can remove some of those excuses and sort of automate some of that, speed things up, and from there if they are legitimately too busy doing some of that stuff, they'll have more time to do some of these things and to focus on the things that you want them to focus on to improve their safety records. Good question.
Perfect. And perfect timing is that.
Yes.
So we are now right at the top of the hour. So I want to thank both of you gentlemen, Selase and Mark, and also all of our audience for joining us today. And we will be making the recording available pretty much as soon as we wrap up. And we hope to see everyone next month for the next edition of CE Inside Webinar Series. Thank you very much.